Welcome to the Future of Less Work, where we explore how work is transforming one conversation at a time. I'm Nirit Cohen, and today's episode is about what happens when AI moves into places where error is not an option. Think banking approvals, medical claims, pharmaceutical compliance, regulated environments where every decision must be auditable, defensible, and accountable. All those back-end business processes where compliance matters, liability matters, and a human name still needs to be attached to the outcome. My guest today is Arya Bolurfrushan, founder and chief executive officer of AppliedAI, which focuses on mission-critical workflows in regulated industries. Arya, welcome to Future of Less Work.
Thank you very much, Nirit. Pleasure to be here.
So this was really interesting when I first read your story. When error is not an option, how does that change how AI gets designed and deployed?
Yeah, so these kind of regulated high cost of error workflows have to have a much more a kind of reliable and rigid runtime setup. So basically, I think the ultimate challenge is how do you maximize probabilistic code flexibility and design time of these business processes, but without losing much more deterministic, reliable runtime when they're actually deployed. If you give AI the same prompt a few times, you'll get slightly different answers every single time.
Exactly. And I mean, we have that message at the bottom of the screen, right? Every time we go into a system, it just says this, they can make errors and you can't have errors.
Yeah. And in particular, when you have, let's say, 100 agents, right? If each one makes a 0.01% error, then you end up with a 30% different answer each time it gets run. So I think that is the fundamental struggle of, enterprise grade AI systems.
So how do you get around that? I mean, ultimately, because every time I speak to leaders implementing AI at enterprise level these days, the biggest conversation is about this two-way door versus one-way door, right? It's like, do I go through and I can't come back and therefore I need to put a person at the gate? Or is this a reversible activity that I can afford to make a mistake and then learn and adapt the system?
So there are a few questions in there. Number one is kind of how do you really adopt this without the fear of having it be a one-way door where you're losing control of a mission-critical system in your organization. And the way that we do that is we say, it doesn't have to be a one-time impact where you can run the kind of AI workflow in parallel as a shadow business process for a while. You compare the results that you're getting from both sides and do it gradually. So you build up the confidence of the other system as opposed to it being a kind of one-day switch. That's one. The other part of your question that's interesting is, we call it supervised automation, where you still are in control and it's fully auditable, as you mentioned, and transparent. And we spend a lot of time, on behalf of ourselves, but also on behalf of our species, thinking about, are humans relevant anymore in these processes? And we think, how we're different from a lot of our peers is we still believe that humans are incredibly important. In particular, not only as a last mile reviewer, as a kind of approver of the AI's work, but also as a co-creator. And how you end up with kind of, how you reset the probabilistic drift that happens in these workflows is by mid-mile human reviews. So we see it as a dance of AI and humans working together, where the human will check not only at the end. So initially, we built these workflows and had the last mile review by the human, but we actually saw the productivity of the human go down. Because they spend most of their time looking for where the compound error started, and then you end up getting frustrated. Say, you know what, I'll just do it myself because which one of these 50 AI agents made a small error? So
yeah, you're saying basically exactly. You're auditing something at the end. If you find a problem, you don't know where it's from. So
Exactly.
You're essentially building checkpoints throughout the process.
Yes.
So you're
exactly.
basically saying we can't really automate these because they are regulated. I mean, you'd think that if
Yeah.
it's regulated, which means that it's very clear what the answers need to be, as opposed to judgment and creativity and everything human, technically you'd think you should be able to fully automate that portion and actually, assume that a technology will make less mistakes than humans. But you're actually saying that no, if we let the system run through the whole process, then there bound to be like a slight error somewhere, which creates a bigger error at the end, and it'll be hard to figure out where that comes from.
Yeah. There's two competing forces. One is that technologically, I think there's a lot that we can automate, but the kind of legal system is still built by humans for humans. So we kind of like are regulating ourselves into relevancy by, at least in these industries. So a human liability catcher has to kind of be around. So let's say you're in Belgium, right, and your insurance claim wasn't approved for a loved one, and they're kind of in the hospital, and you're there. You want to sue because you believe that this is insured under your plan, and you go to the insurance company and say, well, the AI said no. Right? Who do you sue? Who holds the liability? Do you sue Anthropic? Do you sue OpenAI? You have no jurisdiction.
That's a completely different conversation, and we should go there. Right? It's really interesting, and we know this. We see this in the autonomous vehicles, been around a lot longer, right? But in fact, if I understood you correctly, you actually said, forget the lawsuit at the end. We actually won't get the right answer if we let the machines run this through. So, because I was going to ask you, is it a 70-30? Is it a 20-80? People, technology, and you're actually saying it's not even the last mile. It's not even that last gateway I need to build these checkpoints throughout. And I'm trying to figure out, is that a liability thing? Is that because we're building our relevance into this so that we don't get lost in the process? Or is it a real need?
Yeah, a very good question. So, the way we say it is kind of, we can automate a lot of the carbs, but there's still some of the protein that the human needs to do, where there is some human judgment. There is things that are subjective in knowledge work that have to kind of happen, where 4 or 5 reasonable humans will disagree. We'll have a different interpretation of the facts. And a lot of these business processes are multiple disciplines that they go through, right? So if you want to approve a bank loan, as you mentioned initially, there's the underwriter, there's the legal person, there's these levels of different approvals. So the mid-mile, we limit the kind of AI agent to do a particular task. So there's one unit of work that's being done. So, and we call it a singular transformation. So input, transform, output. And then each human review, the ones that you do assign, assess that piece of work. So the reinforcement learning also goes back to a particular transformation. If you want to automate the whole thing, you don't know what was good and what was bad. So if there's that error, it's hard to, you conflate kind of the entirety of the workflow. Yeah. Didn't work. Whereas this way, you understand.
Is that a transition strategy though, Arya, or is that how you see this evolving? So is that because in the meantime, as we learn, this is how we train the system? Or are you saying if we need this to be auditable, if we need a person's name signed to it, we're going to have a person walk with AI agent throughout the entire process?
So okay, very good clarification. I think we can get a little bit deeper here. In order to regulate, you have to be able to inflict suffering, and there is a definition of consciousness, which is the ability to suffer, right? So having a human walk along the path with you is, you actually have a person who's on the hook for the outcome, right? Or who's on the hook for that particular aspect of it. So I do think it's a permanent state of affairs. As long as our legal system remains the way it does, there needs to be a person that is accepting the recommendation of the AI. And I don't think it's fair to have one person own the entirety, because that's too much liability. That's across the entire workflow. So having it broken down within is a much more equitable liability orchestration and suffering orchestration across the
yeah.
stack.
Okay.
Yeah.
So since we're getting philosophical here, so how does that change people's work? Somebody on one of my episodes called some of this work that we were doing in the back end actually robot work, right? I mean, you didn't really think, you didn't really use, human judgment, creativity. You basically just mechanically keyed data or, approved things against scripts or something like that. Does this make this better, or does it actually make it worse?
Yeah, so I think we spend a lot of time with knowledge workers, really kind of, and the part of the data they love the most is these edge cases, right, which makes them think about, okay, what does this mean? Whereas all the drudgery in between is like soul crushing. So you actually start kind of focusing on the parts of the job that you love, right? Which is the higher value stuff of approving. And there is this element of really like unleashing the potential that you could achieve. So if, for example, you could do 50 insurance claims a day, now you can do 500, because of the 50 that you used to do, there was 2 that were interesting. The rest were just the script that you followed, and you just got it done. And now those 2 that you kind of lived for, right? That was like nuance, and you could actually think about, okay, it falls between the rules, and
because the 500 you will be able to quickly audit and say the machine did them correctly. That's what you're saying.
Yeah. So of the 500, probably 480 of them aren't noteworthy, right? They're kind of right in the middle of the script, and those just have to have the final check. And then there's around 10 that are need some attention. Just make sure that you got, and 10 that are very interesting.
Yeah. Okay. And so here's another, because I've actually seen you think through kind of the next level detail, what that does for us as humans. So as you think about that, one of the things that I've been struggling with is a lot of us, we learned how to sense judgment, have kind of that understanding of downstream implications. We learned it because at some point we started with our hands on the keyboard, right? We started reading the scripts or reviewing the details, right? And so we created that sense of understanding. If you skip this phase, and not the transition, right? Today you still have people who remember the job, but you skip the job, and now it's just you bring in people just for that audit, just that V on the 480, attention on the 10, and taking, care of the other 10. What do you think we need to do to train them? How will they ever develop the judgment?
So I spent a lot of time thinking about this, where the kind of entry-level positions where you learn by doing the grunt work until you got to a position where you could, like, it's almost like a sushi chef spends the first 3 years just doing the rice, right, until they can touch a fish. But then there's a part of me that says, how many human calculators were there until we just have calculators now? And my father's, he's in his mid-80s. His mental math is so much better than mine, right? Because he has to do all the math mentally.
Yeah, and we don't. Yeah,
and we don't.
Yeah.
Right? And I just use the calculator for even the most basic stuff, right? And it's like, okay, I've freed up that RAM and I can put it somewhere else, right? Or history, right? He knows all the historical dates, right? And because he had to memorize that at some point, where I never did.
Wikipedia. Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I actually had somebody was complaining to me yesterday about So, I come from a non-English native speaking space, and I think you do too originally. And so I suddenly see all these people write perfectly crafted text. And I was wondering, somebody was saying that doesn't make any sense. And I said, well, why not? I mean, they have the tool to create perfect, it still should be their ideas, right? If they work their ideas into a language that they couldn't before, what's wrong with that, right? So I think that's what you're saying essentially, but we should be able to teach people judgment. And I don't know how to do that yet.
Yeah, just to kind of add to your point is, imagine how many mathematical errors had caused so many inefficiencies back in the day because everyone was doing their own math that, has now been solved. Like what were the efficiency gains globally on commerce with the calculator, right? Or even, we used to have floors of buildings that were typewriters, right? That were just type. So anyway,
but I think about your 10%. So I actually think of the claim gets generated. Somebody looks at it, and they need to understand whether it's part of that middle stack, no issue thing, or something looks wrong. And I wonder how somebody who's never done anything but the last mile understand what it means and is able to recognize when something looks wrong.
So
it's a hard question. I know.
I think a counter argument could be that because they weren't kind of like spoiled by the way that it should be done, they may be a better critical thinker because they're looking at it with a fresh pair of eyes. Because a lot of times folks are like, they're so into the here's how it should be done that they don't look at something with a fresh pair of eyes. That's kind of the most charitable kind of interpretation. The second one is, what we are seeing is a lot of even the biggest corporations don't have standard operating procedures to explain all of the nuance and how things should get done. And a lot of that IP is in the head of the frontline knowledge worker.
Okay, that's really good. So you're saying this is going to force us to document all the exceptions, all the kind of nuances of where we said it doesn't look right. What does that mean, right?
Exactly. So it goes from residing in someone's mind into being institutionalized, which can then be critiqued, right? And
because they'll be taught. Okay, that's a really good one. Thank you for that. So, so what needs to change with the regulation to make people not just a rubber stamp or a name who's liable at the end, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's funny. It's like, have you seen that the website where AI can hire humans now to do things for it?
I'm pretty sure there's still laws against that.
Yeah. So there's some
actually in Europe.
Yeah, where it'll pay you $5. Like, I'll go to Fiverr and say, "Can you go pick this up for me and send it here?" Because my the human asked me to get this done for them. So I do think that we're entering into uncharted territory on a few fronts. And again, to caveat this, who knows? I don't know for sure. This we're all kind of extrapolating our best guess. So I'm very clear-eyed of my lack of knowledge on how things are gonna go. But we're placing bets on the future, and I can just share what our house view is. So we think where humans will reside, and I think a big question that we often we tell all of our partners and customers is, they often come to us and ask, "I want to add an AI agent to my current process," and we say, perhaps a better question is, where do you need to put a human in an AI native process? Right, and that's a very different perspective. So saying it a different way, business process reengineering is a must, and anything besides that is a band-aid.
First of all, I completely agree with you, and I will say that from my HR hat, that actually requires job reengineering, because the reason
Yes.
we're doing this, right, is we're basically saying we keep the jobs, we keep the structures, we keep the workflow, we just bring in agents, as opposed to saying, how could you completely redesign this? And then what kind of structure and jobs and, people you need to build around it, which
Got to invert it.
which not a lot of people are doing at this point, which is, I think, for a really long time, we've talked about AI as a technology challenge. I think the challenge is human. And I think because we are still incapable of the speed of transformation, we don't know how to think outside, our own structures, professions, jobs, roles. It's
phenomenally true.
Yeah.
And I think if you give somebody a blank canvas with a low-code, no-code tool, the limitation is, just as you said, is the human mind is incremental. So we'll just end up recreating our old process again. With a small tweak. So we're very good at finding local optimums and not global optimums. Because
so in the non-regulated industries, right, the way this gets solved is because you get new players and they come with a blank piece of paper and they kind of redo, the what's possible. But you live in regulated industries. That's why this was so interesting for me to talk with you, right? Because in a regulated industry, you can't do that.
Yes. 100%.
Unless the regulated industry gives you, space that is that a sandbox to try different things, right?
So I think what we do is we try and capture. So just finish. The point is, we think AI can actually help you reimagine, right? Because it pushes you out of your box. So just in the workflow generation itself, it can be a mirror to say, wait a minute, I don't need this constraint. So the challenge is, how do you capture in the prompt or in the input, in the context window, all the constraints, right? So one is your intention and job to be done, but then all the constraints around law, right? So here's, the limitations you give the generation around compliance. Then two, your internal policies. So here's all the policies that we have to regulate. It could be ESG, it could be anything else that you have around that. And then we call it almost like compliance as code, where how you raised autonomous driving as an example, where you cannot speed. You cannot, because it won't go above the speed limit, right? So actually, you can be compliant in generation as opposed to trying to catch, people who are speeding. You just built it within the processes. So. So one, we think in regulated industries, you can actually regulate more, right? Because you can actually embed the AI with the constraint of making sure the workflow that's been generated is compliant. Two, and one B is, you can catch, so for example, if you update a law or if you update a policy, there will be, by the time it's kind of implemented, it takes so long because you got to go figure out which one of your processes, had any coverage by that policy or that law, which, who knows, right? So you got to do a process mining operation to go find all the processes that are linked to that change. Then you got to go implement it. Whereas actually, if you have those policies embedded, it can kind of regenerate, and fix itself, which saves you a lot of costs, and it's also in the best interest of the regulator, because now the adoption has been
assuming the systems don't deviate and build a bigger deviation all the time. Yeah, totally understand. So, as you think through this, right? If you think a few years down the road, how do you see supervised automation, or maybe organizations like this look like a few years from now? Where do you see us going? Will the systems be more accurate? Will the regulation change?
So I think if it was a free market, I would be very worried about human involvement. But I think it's not a free market, at least in the regulatory sense, because who runs the regulators and the legislators are still humans. So if AI was equally represented in the Congress, I think maybe we'd be, have some problems. But since the kind of regulatory stack, the deck is stacked in our favor.
So you're actually saying the regulation, the regulatory, or the regulators will protect people through regulation, even if we don't need them.
Yeah, I think it may be our last resort. Like, it may be the last stand.
I'm actually thinking, those elevators where you used to have a person who would press the button for you, and in some places they still exist. And it's like, okay,
quaint.
So you're going to have a person press the button, although the elevator is going on its own, right?
Yeah. So I think, what's the point of a government, right? To make sure people are, in the pursuit of happiness, or in the pursuit of, not chaos. So I do think actually there's a contrarian view where regulations will actually increase, and then that person in the elevator needs to approve the engine in the elevator, and then needs to approve, where it's going, and then needs to approve, how many people get on it. So you actually have like 6 people around an elevator, right? Making sure that the safety is so. And a corporation may have a workforce engineer, kind of engineering the mix between human and AI, may have a model security engineer to approve all the models that are being used. So there's this whole apparatus around the automation, which, by the way, we also had in factories, right? You have these huge machines and people just looking at them, right? Or like Homer Simpson pressing the buttons in a...
Wow. Okay. All right. I'm not sure I like that future version, but because I would much rather say that the person pressing the button should have a nice life, and we should use AI to enable what they need as, enough basic living that if they choose to go fishing, they can. But if they love people, they can sit in the elevator and talk to people, and we'll still pay them something for that. But not sure I'd like to think of this as let's regulate the elevator. So, and I actually think there are real examples like that. When we brought in the car, right? We had a person walk in front of the car waving a red flag saying beware of the engine, right? So we did, that's, it sounds funny, but we actually did do things like that as a species in the past.
Yeah. I mean,
so let me
there's a real global, I think it's more of a issue of meaning. People like having I don't know, like a reason. I mean, if we do the UBI approach, where we give everybody an income, I worry, and this is again not AppliedAI speaking, just me personally, I worry if there's going to be crisis of meaning, where people. I think a few examples that they tried the UBI, there was a big rise in addiction and drinking, and
I think UBI, so universal basic income, is this right now is just the way we think of this, because we think of income, right? But if you actually step back and look at the history, and you think, okay, 100 years ago, people did not get free education, and they did not get free healthcare. They didn't even get their vacation and things like that, right? And over the years, we've created more of a social safety net infrastructure that gives citizens, because they are citizens, certain rights, including free education, including in some places of the world, even higher education, in some places of the world, medical services, right? So I don't think of this as universal basic income, but I basically say, if you work for food, shelter, clothing, kind of the basic tenets of living, we should be moving into an age of abundance. I think Peter Diamandis calls it, and people should get more of that very basic. You don't need to. So you can work, but you don't need to work for food, right, or housing.
So I think this is something that we feel very passionate about, and we literally spend the weekend speaking about this with the team, where, in these massive increases in productivity that we've experienced with the car, we experienced with industrial revolution, it actually took us 2 world wars to process and digest that change. where there was a lot of the kind of the gains, the productivity gains accrued to the capital owners, and there was times where folks got together and said, we want our share of it, and communism was an approach, fascism was an approach. I mean, there was a lot of literal showdowns of what to do with this extra capacity, right?
Yes.
Who do we give it to? Do we have the robber barons and the rest of us, with minimum wage, or do you have the so? One thing that we feel passionately about is we need to share the productivity gains back with the people doing the work in the front lines in some way, or else there's going to be much worse than what happened in the last 100 years. And I think I think Elon calls it the supersonic tsunami. So a big part of what we're building is actually helping incentivize knowledge workers to automate. Because one of the big blockers in adoption is actually sabotage, where folks, who have all this IP in their head in the front line, like, why should I teach the AI? Like, I'll actually misteach it, or make sure it fails, or I'll kind of will sabotage it because I don't want. And it's not nefarious. It's just human nature to protect their living.
There's actually research, and I did write about that recently at Forbes, where the more people are exposed to AI, the more they fear it because they see what it can do to them. And one of the, circling right back to where we had this conversation, one of the interesting exceptions to that was Singapore, because instead of the AI being something in the hands of the companies for financial reasons as a tool for productivity, it was being treated as a social infrastructure from the country to the citizens, so that they learn the tools they need to create their careers and thrive in the age of AI. And that's exactly that shift, right?
I think it's so important. And I think it's like incentives. So maybe instead of UBI, there's some other mechanism where you actually gain from the improvement of AI in some way. So we think, for example, something as simple as, why have we inherited this model of pricing labor with time, right? That makes no sense.
Which is only salaried employees, right? I mean, salaried employees get paid for showing up, because the whole independent economy gets paid for delivering.
Exactly. And I think that's a lesson, an experiment that actually succeeded, as opposed to UBI. So if we actually make outcome-based labor, versus one that's based on time, you actually start gaining from the increase in productivity because the outcomes go up, and we share the spoils.
Exactly. And I called this podcast "The Future of Less Work," not because I think, not the dystopian version of technology would take the work, but actually because I think we should be doing less of what doesn't matter and more of what does.
100%.
100%. So Arya, just as we wrap up, I always ask this question, right? What is the one question you think we should be asking ourselves about the future of work? Hard question, huh?
Yeah. It's harder if you you don't want to give like a LLM style answer. And like actually
you don't have the LLM at your disposal right now. Yeah. You're all human.
Yeah. No, but like in answer outside of the standard answers. I mean, this is, again, I think the very fundamental nature of work is going to change. It's going to become, as you said, voluntary in some way. Therefore, what is work? If it's your passion that you're doing, is that really work, or it's just the hobby? If you're not doing it to pay your basic necessities, right? Is that still, I got to go to work, or I want to go to work? What happens when you don't work? There's one view that you return to a much more spiritual place, and you're kind of like more with family, and you do what you love. There's one that like you fill the time with addiction and it goes to a very negative place where you kind of like you've lost your raison d'etre. So I think the one question is understanding from a first principles perspective what really is work.
Yeah. Yeah. And by the way, you went there, I think, so if you ask yourself a question, right, it's why do I work?
Why do I work?
And what will I want to do with the time that AI frees up for me?
Yes.
And why, right? Wow. So we started with heavily regulated industries and landed right in the middle of very interesting human transformations. Thank you, Arya. Yeah.
One last remark closing is the first tagline of the company when we started 5 years ago was "It's about time," and that was upon that like in a world of abundance, the only thing scarce is time. And why are we selling time? And what would you do when we give you back time?
Yeah. So it should be. So I, in my keynotes, I talk about what happened to us as a collective during COVID. Is we realized that life was short, and every day we go to work is a day of our life we trade, and suddenly we were renegotiating some of that time. So. Definitely with you on that. Thank you, Arya. Really, it's been a pleasure speaking with you today. For more about Arya Bolurfrushan and Applied AI, you'll find the links in the episode description. If this episode resonated with you, share it with someone navigating AI transformation in organizations. And remember, your best people do not work because they have to. They don't work because you tell them to, or you measure them on it. They work because they want to. Because by working for you, they're doing what's important to them in life. Till next time.